If you think you know what isolation feels like, step inside the world of Ted Kaczynski. It's 1998. A steel door shuts with a sound that seems to last forever. The man behind it, once a mathematics prodigy, now branded the Unabomber, has arrived at ADX Florence, Colorado's fortress of solitude. The Alcatraz of the Rockies. Inside this supermax prison, the air itself feels heavier. Every movement is watched, every word recorded. The corridors are lined with reinforced concrete and cameras that never blink. There is no sound of voices, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the mechanical sigh of air vents. For Ted Kaczynski, this was the end of a long, violent chapter and the beginning of an endless silence. Born in Chicago in 1942, Kaczynski had once been a child genius. He entered Harvard at 16, taught mathematics at Berkeley, and later abandoned society altogether, retreating into a cabin in Montana with no electricity, no running water, and a deep hatred for the modern world. Between 1978 and 1995, he mailed or hand-delivered bombs that killed 3 people and injured 23 others, attacks he claimed were acts of resistance against industrial civilization. Now, his world was reduced to 12 by 7 feet. His ADX cell had concrete walls, a steel sink, a bed molded from the floor, and a slit window too narrow to see the sky. Meals slid through a slot in the door. Human contact was measured in seconds. Each day followed a pattern so precise it could drive a mind to madness, and for some inmates, it did. But Kaczynski was different. The solitude that broke others became his domain. He read constantly, philosophy, history, ecology, writing letters in his tight, precise handwriting. Some went to journalists, others to academics who studied his manifesto, industrial society, and its future. Even within the walls of ADX, his mind roamed free, dissecting ideas of technology, freedom, and control. Guards described him as quiet, disciplined, almost mechanical in his habits. He rarely spoke, never complained. To the staff, he was just inmate 04475-046, housed near some of America's most dangerous men. Ramzi Youssef, the 1993 World Trade Center bomber, was only a few cells away. Terry Nichols, Timothy McVeigh's co-conspirator, was nearby. Each lived in the same silence, isolated by concrete and distance, forming a kind of invisible society of ghosts. Kaczynski's days were stripped of color. He exercised alone in a cage no larger than a garage. The sun reached him for just an hour a day, filtered through wire mesh. His mail was screened, his reading material censored. Even his typewriter, a manual model permitted for writing letters, was inspected before and after each use. Still, he maintained a ritual of thought. Every morning he stood near the window slit, calculating where the sun would appear. Every night he listed topics to ponder the next day: technology's moral cost, human alienation, the price of progress. His mind refused to rust. Psychologists who studied the effects of ADX confinement called it the architecture of control. The design itself, the angles, the lighting, the acoustics, was meant to erase individuality. Kaczynski, who had fled the modern world to escape control, now lived in the purest form of it. In letters, he hinted at the irony. The system has perfected its prison, he wrote once. And yet, in their perfection, they reveal their own chains. Outside the walls, society had largely moved on. The Unabomber's name became a historical footnote, a warning from a bygone era. But inside ADX, time barely existed. The silence grew heavier as years turned into decades. Kaczynski aged quietly, hair graying, face hollowing, but his eyes stayed alert, analytical. Guards sometimes caught him staring through the slit of his window, watching the snow collect on the concrete courtyard. They said it looked like he was studying a formula only he could understand. In the rare moments of sound, footsteps echoing down the tier, the clang of another inmate's door, he would pause, listen, then return to his notebook, as if cataloging the rhythm of captivity itself. He wrote letters to other intellectual prisoners, debating philosophy, the environment, and the collapse of human autonomy. Even from within absolute solitude, He maintained a strange kind of dialogue with the world, a mind in exile, still reaching out through walls. For most men, ADX was a punishment of the body. For Ted Kaczynski, it became an experiment of the mind. But even the sharpest intellect cannot escape the slow corrosion of isolation. And deep inside the concrete labyrinth of Florence, Colorado, cracks had begun to form, not in the walls, but within the man who had once tried to reshape the world. Because in a place designed to silence every sound, sometimes the loudest voice you hear is your own. Inside ADX Florence, the seasons came and went unseen. The sun crossed the narrow window slit like a metronome marking years. For Ted Kaczynski, each day was a loop, precise, predictable, and sealed from the chaos of the outside world. He woke at 5:30 a.m., folded his blanket, and washed his face in cold water from the steel sink. Breakfast arrived through the slot in his door. The tray would scrape the metal, and the sound echoed like an alarm. That was the only human exchange he had until evening. ADX was built on a philosophy of control through sensory deprivation. No conversations, no recreation with others, no contact beyond brief words to guards. Even the library was digital, requests sent on slips of paper, books delivered days later by officers in gloves. And yet, inside that tiny cell, Kaczynski built an intellectual universe. He studied every book he could get: mathematics, philosophy, anthropology. He reread Dostoevsky and Orwell, annotated works on environmental ethics. His letters to academics and journalists were dense, handwritten essays exploring industrial collapse and human alienation. Some correspondents described his tone as eerily calm, logical, and detached, a scientist studying his own captivity. He wrote about how solitude refined his thoughts, how modern civilization had turned people into slaves to their machines. "The walls," he wrote, "protect me from the noise of the world I rejected." He didn't ask for pity. He never spoke about remorse. To him, his imprisonment was proof of the system he had always condemned, a structure that valued technology and power over individual freedom. The guards learned his rhythm, always punctual, polite, never violent. "He's not like the others," one officer once said. "He's a man who built his own prison long before he came here." But inside the human mind, time is not easily tamed. Days blurred into months, months into years. The isolation that once felt like control began to distort perception. He would hear faint echoes, the clink of a key, the rush of air through the vents, and wonder if the sounds were real or imagined. Psychologists warn that long-term isolation could lead to social death, a state where the mind forgets how to exist among people. For Kaczynski, who had chosen solitude years before, the difference was that now he couldn't walk away from it. He began writing more frequently to his family, especially his brother David, the man who had helped identify him to the FBI in 1996 after recognizing his writing style in the Unabomber manifesto. Their letters were cautious but revealing. Ted wrote of his health, his routines, his small intellectual victories, and occasionally, his resentment. Forgiveness was never offered, the past was a sealed chapter. Outside ADX, journalists debated whether Kaczynski was a monster or a philosopher who had crossed a line. Documentaries dissected his motives, while his own letters were studied in universities as examples of radical thought. His manifesto, dense, methodical, prophetic, resurfaced in discussions about technology's dangers. But in the cell, none of that mattered. He didn't see the debates. He only saw concrete. ADX officials monitored his mail carefully. Every sentence was read, every name logged. When a new generation of admirers began writing to him, young people who saw him as a warning or, disturbingly, a hero, the prison restricted his correspondence further. Kaczynski was aware. He once wrote, "People project what they need to see. They want myths, not men." To survive, he created routines that mirrored the life he once had in Montana. He sketched diagrams of trees from memory. He tracked sunrise angles. He mentally reconstructed the sound of wind through pine needles. In the quiet, memory became the only wilderness he had left. But the body could not thrive where the mind was consumed. years of confinement aged him rapidly. His back bent slightly, his gait slowed. He suffered from chronic health problems, hypertension, digestive issues, and refused most medical interventions. Despite that, his discipline remained rigid. When he was allowed 1 hour of recreation in the small, walled yard, he would pace in precise geometric patterns, counting his steps. Sometimes, he looked up toward the faint strip of sky and squinted, as if calculating distance to something unreachable. The guards said he almost never looked directly at them. He would nod, return to his books, and sink again into silence. For the Bureau of Prisons, ADX worked as intended, total containment. For Kaczynski, it was both punishment and validation, proof that the modern world had built the perfect machine for isolation. And yet, somewhere beneath the layers of logic and routine, something human remained, a flicker of fatigue, of frailty. When he wrote about the passing of time, his words began to shift. He spoke of decay, of mechanisms failing, of systems reaching entropy. It was unclear if he meant civilization or himself. By 2021, he was transferred from ADX Florence to a federal medical facility in North Carolina due to declining health. For the first time in decades, he shared proximity with others, even if only through narrow hallways. The man who once fled humanity had returned to it by necessity. In a letter not long after his transfer, he wrote simply, "Isolation is not freedom when it is forced. It is only a mirror, and you cannot live inside a mirror forever." He had spent 25 years inside America's most silent prison, outlasting most of his generation. But even in perfect solitude, time always wins. And for Ted Kaczynski, the countdown had already begun. By the time Ted Kaczynski reached his 80s, the world that once fueled his anger had transformed. The technologies he feared, digital surveillance, global networks, artificial intelligence, were now everyday tools. What he'd warned of had become the ordinary rhythm of modern life. But Ted Kaczynski no longer saw any of it. His universe had narrowed to a hospital wing. In 2021, after decades at ADX Florence, he was transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. The move wasn't mercy, it was necessity. His health had declined beyond what the supermax could manage. There, in a sterile room that smelled of antiseptic and age, the man once known as the Unabomber faced the only force that could truly cage him, time. The Butner facility was different from ADX. There were voices in the halls, the distant beeping of monitors, the shuffle of medical carts. For a man who had lived in silence for more than 2 decades, the noise was almost unbearable. Nurses described him as polite but withdrawn, still reading, still writing letters, his handwriting smaller and shakier with each passing month. He rarely spoke of the past. When he did, it was brief, analytical, never emotional. To one correspondent, he wrote, "Human suffering is built into the design of progress. You cannot fix the machine without destroying it." He lived like a man conducting the final experiment of his own mind, testing how long conviction could survive confinement. Outside, his legend had taken on a strange afterlife. Documentaries, podcasts, and college courses dissected the contradictions of his existence: the genius who became a recluse, the recluse who became a killer, the killer who became a symbol of modern alienation. Some admired his intellect. Others despised his philosophy. But nearly everyone agreed, his life was a warning about the dangerous intersection between brilliance and isolation. Kaczynski, however, never sought redemption. In his view, society's descent into technological dependence had proven his thesis. The irony was total: while the world moved deeper into digital connection, he died in the analog quiet of federal custody. By 2023, his health had worsened. He was found unresponsive in his cell at the age of 81. Officials confirmed he had died in federal custody after decades of confinement. His body was claimed by no family, only records, case files, and the echo of his ideas. There was no ceremony. No eulogy. Just another line added to a database: deceased, June 10, 2023. In the aftermath, the world barely paused. News headlines flashed his name again, Unabomber found dead at 81. For a few hours, old photographs resurfaced, the bearded man in the hood, the manifesto's pages, the Montana cabin surrounded by pine trees. Then, as quickly as it appeared, his story faded back into silence. But inside those silences remained questions that America still struggles to answer. What happens when a mind built for solitude collides with a society built for noise? What happens when isolation becomes the only truth a person can trust? ADX Florence still stands in the Colorado desert, its walls unbroken, its silence intact. New inmates occupy the same cells, follow the same routines, count the same hours that once defined Ted Kaczynski's life. For all his intellect and defiance, he became the very embodiment of the system he despised, a man swallowed by the machine he warned against. His rebellion against modernity ended not in chaos, but in a quiet room filled with nothing but air and the ticking of a clock. In the end, there was no manifesto left to write. No audience left to defy. Only the endless hum of a prison built to erase sound, and the faint echo of a man who once believed silence could change the world. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.